Thank you for staying with Newsfeed, the AM edition. I'm Hugo Ribatika on this Mother's Day. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa says South Africa's proposal at the World Trade Organization to waive intellectual property rights for the manufacture of COVID-19 vaccines is now supported by over 100 countries. He made the call during a webinar on vaccine financing, a move that would enable countries in Africa and other developing countries to manufacture vaccines more cheaply. Joining us to discuss why this is an important move is UN Special Representative for the Right to Health, Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng. Dr. Mofokeng, very good morning. Thank you for speaking to us. And obviously, happy Mother's Day.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Now, take us briefly through the significance of this waiver if it does come through.
I think there's been a journey and often an untold story about how we got to this point. In November 2020, the UN experts, including myself as a special rapporteur on the right to health, released a statement in support of the proposal by South Africa and India to have temporary waiver of intellectual property to support vaccine manufacturing. And since then, there's been a quiet state of affairs globally, and up to a point where it lay upon civil society and organizations in different countries, including South Africa, really taking the issue head on as a health equity issue, which it is, and up to the stage where we are now, where the US has, I think, bended under the public pressure and scrutiny to then support some form of a temporary waiver. But there are details in there that I think we may miss them if we just gloss over and just be excited at this announcement, because the US doesn't support the current TRIPS waiver as it's currently proposed. They have their own ideas that they want to negotiate.
Now, you talk about a journey having commenced 9 months ago. Now that we've reached this phase where 100 countries are supporting it, what's the next stage?
The next stage is to get this resolution supported and passed through the World Trade Organization. I think it's important, again, to be vigilant about the type of negotiations and the type of language and restrictions that the US and other high-income countries want to impose. It's very important to reiterate, again, that this issue of COVID-19 and vaccine equity it's part of the bigger picture around, again, sharing knowledge with diagnostics, testing equipment, as well as treatment. And we know that in terms of the pharmaceutical companies and the industry, in terms of the data through research that they've been able to gather, other countries need access to that. And I'm afraid with the types of negotiations that are being proposed, we may lose the bigger picture. It may just be about just sharing the recipe, for example, to produce the vaccine, but not much else, because we know low-income countries and middle-income countries like South Africa, we don't only need just the recipe, we need to scale up manufacturing and development, we need to scale up our distribution capacity and strengthen the health system in terms of being able to then manage at that micro-district level the distribution of the vaccine. So it's about the entire chain and not just the recipe of how to make the vaccine.
Interesting that you raise that, because that's the point of my next question, which is to say that if we did get sign-off today, what are sort of processes that we would look at as Africa? Admittedly, not every single country is going to have capacity to produce vaccines. What sort of period are we looking at in terms of downtime before it actually starts production?
So the good thing about the African continent is that while all of the politics were hindering vaccine development on the continent, there has been, through the African Union, some organization of the African countries that are represented in the African Union. We know SADC itself has some agreements right around trade and knowledge sharing. And so I'm convinced that should that sign-off happen, and it should happen really quickly, because human lives are at risk here. And I think in South Africa, if you look at Egypt, if you look at Morocco, right, so many other African countries have capacity, internal capacity to produce, manufacture and distribute. So it's really just that we are being held back by the lack of scientific knowledge sharing, and of course by intellectual property, which is held by multiple agencies at different levels. And I think that will be the hardest battle. Once that's won, I think it's almost all systems goes, and we hope that all countries are working behind the scenes to ready themselves for that moment, so that we don't again have major delays and lags when then people are now only scrambling to try and get their regulations as well as their manufacturing capacity up to standard.
Well, I understand that the UK other members of the European Union, and certainly the big pharmaceutical companies have obviously not come to the party, so to speak. Take us through areas of resistance in getting this signed off.
Yeah, I think people often will say, well, you know, this will mean that people who discover in terms of the scientific industry, there will be no rewards or incentives for discovery if it means that knowledge is just being shared widely. And the counter to that is that this is just a temporary waiver. It's not a full-on patent waiver for lifetime. It's a temporary waiver to allow humanity to come through this disaster. And I think that's what's really important. But the other argument is that, you know, people have been focused on reopening economies. And how are you going to open economies without a population that's healthy and well? There is no economy without people. So we have to prioritize humans first. And of course, the argument all the time that profits will be dented and you know, there'll be no incentive for pharmaceutical companies. But the truth of the matter is they've been making money many years over patents, and even that law itself needs to be re-looked at to say, is it serving the purpose it was intended when it was proposed and passed all those years ago, and is this a moment truly in time to really, and I agree and absolutely support civil society who says you cannot you know, put forward and as in the form of hierarchy where you prioritize pharmaceuticals and profits over human lives. This is really just about human rights, the right to health, and the underlying determinants of health. And vaccine, access to a vaccine is part of essential medicines, which are a human rights issue.
Doc, give us a perspective on the sort of numbers that we're talking about in terms of what do these large pharmaceutical companies stand to lose?
So here's part of the problem around this issue, whether you are in civil society advocating or you are, you know, like some of us who are human rights experts supposed to be advising the Human Rights Council, is that the non-disclosure agreements that many of these pharmaceutical companies have demanded lower middle income countries and high income countries to sign means that we actually do not have that access. Right? It means that they are starving everybody of knowledge so that we can hold them accountable. Because for accountability to happen, we would need to have transparency, we would need to have information. And I think part of making governments sign NDAs is not only an issue of accountability in terms of citizens not being able to hold their own governments accountable, but pharmaceutical companies know that if we don't know what's in there, they can't be held accountable by anybody. And that's the crux of the issue, is that they are massive non-disclosure agreements that even countries such as South Africa have entered into, and no one knows the details of such agreements.
So when you talk about the extent, or certainly estimate the extent to which large pharmaceutical companies are impacted, the next question that arises is, what are the estimated timelines between the 9 months that it's taken to get 100 countries sign off, and just as well Joe Biden's in power, and he's certainly signed off segments of it, to, is it another 2 months, is it another 3 months, are we expecting to wait another 9 months?
It could be another year even, right? And the problem with what has been proposed and supported by the high-income countries is that they want to negotiate. And as you can appreciate, once you go into a process of negotiation, that in itself can take many, many months. And it's not even that the WTO, for example, can't pass a resolution to support this. It's that the negotiation process itself may delay that. And there can always be a special seating at the WTO to precisely deal with this resolution, again, proposed by South Africa and India. I think that's very significant. And I think, for me, that's the worry, is that the U.S. administration is not supporting the current waiver suggestions and proposal as it is in its entirety. They're supporting it, but pending negotiations, and I think that's the crux. And we don't know how that will be. And the cry from all over the world is that we do not have time. We do not have time to sit and be negotiating about very clear issues on human rights. And we need more than just the vaccine know-how. We need all the data that has been collected up to this stage around testing and regulation bodies, and we also need diagnostics and treatment.
So Dr. Tlaleng, where's the give and take from us as African countries, us as developing countries? Because obviously we have the short end of the stick in that, as things that currently stand, those that have been producing the vaccine are entitled to whatever rights that they have. Surely at some point we should be saying, it's a give and take. Let's relent to some degree in order to make progress, as opposed to accept and sign off as we desire.
I think it's important to remind all of us that these are human rights issues, and they really speak to the core minimum obligations around human rights. And access to vaccines and essential medicines is part of that. States have an obligation to fulfill and respect those human rights, right, around, of course, underlying determinants of health, but also around prevention and treatment. So the give and take, that discussion has already happened at the Human Rights Council, and member states agreed that these are the principles that we are going to hold each other and selves accountable to. And so, in my opinion, there isn't another negotiation that needs to happen on human rights, because we've already discussed that. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is very clear about what should be happening, and therefore the fact that we are geographically located in Africa doesn't mean we need to be disadvantaged even further through negotiation, through sort of like a give and take. How do I give and take and negotiate upon my humanity and my right to life and my right to health? And I think we really have to push back on that idea that African countries or lower income countries, even the small islands and developing countries, have to sort of go into this other performance of our humanity. Human rights and many resolutions in the UN, I mean, if you look at General Comment number 14, speaks exactly and precisely to what is expected of even pharmaceutical companies. There's guiding principles on human rights, and those are the types of documents and resolutions we should be using in our own defense to say you cannot dehumanize us further, and there should not be another expectation that the African continent and its people still need to go and convince others of their own rights, and in this instance their right to health.
Dr. Tlaleng, my final question. Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's head of WTO, is obviously an African. Does this make that process any easier?
I can tell you that the systems that all of us are operating within are quite bureaucratic, and they have, their own historical challenges and their own internal issues. And I know and I sympathize with her that she may be an African woman and she may have her own ideas that she wants to push, but she's going into a whole machinery, right? And it won't take just like a light switch pub, because she has walked in, everything will change. We believe in her leadership, we support her leadership, but we also understand that this is not going to be a one-day battle. It's going to be long-term. And really, again, it raises very important issues about African countries that still have to go into debt to be able to afford the vaccines. And how does the WTO play a role in that, where honestly and truly the reasons why most of these countries are in debt, we can talk about colonization and extraction of minerals on the African continent, but those are the types of contexts we're talking about, that even in 2021, with that history, how are we expected to be the ones to be negotiating on our rights and on our health? But we support her, and we believe in her leadership.
Dr. Tlaleng, thank you so much for your time this morning. UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health, Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng.